Hey guys and girls, and welcome back to episode 6 in this series where we are building a GraphQL API in Elixir and Phoenix. So what I want to do in this episode is implement our first query and our first mutation and implement our first type, which is going to be the user. So before we do that, I forgot to add a do at the end of the dev module. Please make sure you have that, otherwise you're going to get a compile error. And like I explained in the last episode, our Absinthe schema is where all our subscriptions, mutations, and queries go into, but we also need to define what our types are that the queries, mutations, and subscriptions are going to work with. So we already made a schema folder in the last episode, so what I want to do is add in our schema folder a new file, and that one is going to be called user type. And what this is going to do, it's going to tell our GraphQL layer of this application what a user should look like if we reference it in the context of our GraphQL API. So we're going to make a new dev module, which is going to be, of course, medium GraphQL API. It is in our it's in our web folder, so we need to add that. It's going to be our schema.types.userType module. And in here we need to import a function set of Absinthe. And I can't see my keyboard because my mic is in the way, but Absinthe.schema.notation. There we go. And in here, we're going to define what our user data structure is going to look like. So we do that by calling object and then giving it a name. We're going to call it user_type. And it's a function. And in here, we're going to define the fields that the user type is going to have. So in our case, our user is going to have a field with an ID, and after the name that you give it, you're going to give it a GraphQL data type, and in our case it's going to be an ID as well. We are going to give it a field with a first name, and I can't type at the moment, that's amazing, which is going to be a string. We have a field called last name, which is going to be a string. We have an email field, which is also going to be a string. Then we have a role field, which is also going to be a string. And we have, what else do we have? We have, let's have a look at our user model. Email, first name, last name, password, and a role. So I think that's actually it. Email, password, first name, last name, role. Yeah, that's it. So let's save that. So yeah, we have a user type that is going to look like this, and we're also going to have a user input type. So the object user type is what GraphQL is going to use as a reference of how to display a user, but when we actually need to input data, we're going to use a different object, and that is going to be input object, and we can do that below the other object. So we're going to say input_object, and we're going to give it a name, and we're going to give it the name user_input_type, and we're going to define what it's going to look like, and we're going to have a field with a first name, which is going to be non-null, and what that means is that you have to provide this data. We are going to have a last name, which is also going to be non-null. And a string. We are going to have a field with a email, which is also non-null. Oh. And it's going to be a string. We're going to have a password field, non-null, and a string. And a field password underscore confirmation, which is also going to be non-null, and a string. So we have a first name, a last name, an email, a password, and a password confirmation field on the input object. All right, so now that we have our types defined, let's import them into our schema file. And what I like to do is, because in a big application, your schema file is going to be quite big. And if you individually import all your types, it's going to be quite a long list. So what I like to do is in our schema folder, make a new file called types.ex and import them all in here, and then import this file into our schema file. But it's up to you. You can do whatever you want. This is just the way I like to do it. So this is going to be a dev module again, which is called medium GraphQL API web .schema.types. And in here we're going to use the Absinthe schema.notation. And we're gonna alias all the types that we defined. And then here we can say import types. And for now we're gonna import the user type and save that. And then if we go into our schema, just below here, we are gonna say import types, and in here we can say medium GraphQL API web .schema.types. And now we have access to all the types in this file. Okay, so let's quickly add this to our branch. So git add, git commit, add user types to schema. All right, so let's implement our first query, and we are gonna do that by first giving it a description, which is going to be a string, and our first query is just going to be a list of all the users we have in our database. So we can give it a description, get a list of all users. This is optional, but it gives you a nice description in the web interface. Then you specify a field. We are going to call it users, which is going to be a list of, and here we implement the type that we made, which is going to be the user underscore type. And in here we are going to make a reference to a resolver that we need to build, and what it's going to look like. Resolve, then we reference the resolver. We're going to reference the user resolver that we're going to build in a sec. And we reference the function in the user resolver. In our case, it's going to be users. And it's a function with 3 arguments, so that's how you specify that. So I'm going to save that for now. And now we need to build our resolvers. And the resolvers are the functions that are going to run whenever we reference this query. And we are going to make a new folder in here. So let's say resolvers. And in here, we are going to make the user resolver. New file. User underscore resolver.ex. And of course, I'm making a dev module with the name medium GraphQL API web dot resolvers dot user resolver. And in here we are going to build a resolver, and it's going to look like this. Is going to be a function, and we called it users. And a resolver can take in 3 arguments. For now, we don't care what they are because we're not going to use them. And in here, what the resolver always needs to return is a tuple with OK. And then we can specify the function in the controller that we need to use. And if we want to get a list of all the users, let's have a look in accounts. There already is a function called list users. So we just need to reference that. So we can say OK, and then accounts dot list users. And because we're referencing accounts, we need to alias it. So at the top, alias medium GraphQL API. It's in our API folder, not the web folder, because it's the controller. Dot accounts. There we go. So we're referencing this now. This looks to be good. So now we need to import our resolvers in our schema file. So at the top, web.resolvers. And if you do mix compile now, and we need an S here. And now we actually are referencing this module. Okay. So I think this actually should work. So everything is safe. Now let's run the server and see if we can run our first query. So it is running. So let's open our browser and go to localhost 4000 API GraphQL. And we actually have our interface up and running. That's great. And if we look in on the right side, there's this nifty docs tab, and we can see that there's a query. And we actually can see that there is a user field that returns a list of users. And we have the description here that we defined in our schema, get a list of all users. So I think we only have 1 user at the moment, but we can check that out by asking for the name, the first name, last name, and the role. And if we run this now, we actually get our data. A user with a role of user, last name Potter, first name Harry, and an ID of 1. That's great. So we know that we now can query our database and get our users. So now let's implement our first mutation, which is going to be pretty similar. Let's uncomment this block because we're going to implement our first mutation. And we can give it a description as well. And we will call it register a new user. And in here, we will create a new field called register user. The type is gonna be a user type. And in here we need to reference how to resolve this mutation. So we can say we go into the resolvers, the user resolver, and we are going to reference the function that we haven't created yet, but we will, register underscore user, and it's also going to be a function with 3 arguments. And because this is a mutation, we actually need input from our user. And in a mutation, you define it by referencing arg as in arguments, and then we are going to call the key input, and then the argument is non-null. The user has to give this, and then we can reference a type, and we made a user input type. So the user input type is what we defined in our input object, the user input type. So this is what the user needs to give us. So that's what this mutation expects. Okay, let's save it. And then let's go into our user resolver. So we said, okay, there's a field register user in our schema. It returns a user type. It expects arguments, a map with a key input, and then the value is a map with a user input type. And it's going to resolve in the user resolver, and it points to the register user function. So in our user resolver, we are going to make the resolver register user. And now we actually are going to use the second argument in this function, which is the inputs. And we know that we called the key, we called it input. And we actually care about the map that is the value of the key input. So we can pattern match it by saying input, and that is what we're going to use in this function. And we can just pass it to the accounts dot create user function with the input that we pattern matched above. Okay, so let's go over it quickly. We made a mutation. We called it, gave it a description, register a new user. The field is register user. It returns a user type. The argument that we give is a map with the first key inputs and then a map with the user input type that we defined in our user type. That's this block. And then we resolve by going to the user resolver to register user. The register user pattern matches the input that we provide and passes it to the accounts.createUser function. And then the createUser function actually puts it in the change set and tries to insert it into our database. So let's give it a go. Let's see if everything works. So let's restart the server quickly. And if we go to our web browser, let's refresh this quickly. And in our documentation, we should see a mutation register user, which expects an input with a user input type. And if we take a look, it expects an email, first name, last name, password, and password confirmation. It's going to return a user type, which is the fields that we defined. And it has a description, register a new user. So let's give it a go. we're gonna say mutation. Oh, we don't need that. Mutation. Register a new user. Expects an input with an email. Let's for now say bob@bob.com. Then we need a first name, Bob, a last name, which is Van Dijk, a password, which is going to be password, and a password confirmation, which is going to be password, password as well. And then what we get back is a user type. So in our case, we want to get the ID, first name, last name, email, and the role. Okay, so let's see if this works. Let's play, and there we go. We created a new user, Bob Van Dijk, ID of 2 with an email. So it should be in our database now. So if we, for example, create another one, called this Kim, at Kim, first name, Kim K. We created a third user, nice. And if we run our query now, we should get all 3 users. So let's get the ID, the first name, last name, email, and the role, and hit enter. And now we have all 3 users. So everything is working. Let's have a quick look in the database if the passwords are being hashed correctly. We go to our user table, and we can see that all the passwords are nicely hashed in our database. Awesome. So our first query and our first mutation is working. So that was it. That was what I wanted to do in this episode. In the next episode, we are probably... I have to think about it. We might implement JWT tokens or start with our blog post model. But I'll get back on that. But for now, let's quickly kill our server and add this. So we say git add, git commit, add first query and mutation. And for now, let's just end this branch. So git flow feature finish. So we are on our development branch. It's taking a little while. There we go. Yeah, so now our branch is clean, and let's push this to GitHub. Git push origin develop. So that's it for now. I hope to see you in the next episode. If you have any questions or tips or stuff like that, leave them in the comments below. And I hope to see you next time.